The Western alliance isn't cracking. It already cracked, and the establishment media is working overtime to make sure you don't notice. While NATO holds press conferences about unity and solidarity, 3 of its member states just made a choice that changes everything. They didn't leave the alliance. They did something far more strategic. They joined China's parallel financial system while keeping their NATO badges polished and visible. This isn't speculation. This is documented policy shift happening right now in 2024, and it reveals something deeply uncomfortable about the actual state of Western power. Here's what nobody tells you. The West versus China narrative you see on the news is a performance behind closed doors. The math has changed. And when the math changes, countries follow the money, not the speeches. I'm going to show you 3 systems that are operating simultaneously, not theories, not predictions. 3 documented mechanisms that are reshaping global power while commentators argue about whether we're in a new Cold War. By the end of this, you'll understand why the word alliance doesn't mean what it used to mean and why that matters more than any aircraft carrier deployment. System 1, the dual membership strategy. Let me start with Hungary because their moves are the most explicit. In March 2024, Hungary became the first NATO country to formally join China's Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank Governance Committee. Not as an observer, as a decision maker. Viktor Orban didn't hide this. He announced it at a Budapest Economic Forum. And here's the number that matters. Hungary committed $1.47 billion to Chinese-led infrastructure projects, specifically bypassing EU procurement rules that would have required competitive bidding. But Hungary is the loud one. The interesting players are the quiet ones. Greece and Portugal both signed memorandums of understanding with China's new development bank in late 2023. You didn't see headlines because these weren't called agreements in the press releases. They were labeled enhanced cooperation frameworks. The language is deliberately boring. The substance is not. Greece now has 43% of its port infrastructure operated by Chinese state enterprises. The Port of Piraeus, NATO's largest Mediterranean naval logistics hub for refueling and resupply, is managed by COSCO, a company that answers directly to Beijing's State Council. Let that sink in for a second. A Chinese state company controls the port infrastructure that NATO uses to project power into the eastern Mediterranean. When I was speaking with a shipping analyst in Athens last year, he told me something I haven't forgotten. We don't ask whether NATO or China matters more. We ask who pays the port fees on time. That's the world we actually live in, not the one in policy papers. Here's what makes this system one. These countries aren't choosing China over NATO. They're choosing both. Dual membership. They attend NATO summits, they host military exercises, they vote for sanctions resolutions in Brussels, and then they sign infrastructure deals, accept Chinese investment, and integrate their economies into Beijing's frameworks. The technical term for this is strategic hedging. The honest term is playing both sides. Most people think this is opportunism. But here's what's really happening. These countries have run the numbers and they've concluded that the future isn't bipolar. It's not pick America or pick China. The future is multilateral leverage where your value comes from being the bridge, not the loyalist. And System 1 works because neither Washington nor Beijing can afford to force the choice. If NATO expels Hungary for Chinese cooperation, it breaks the alliance's credibility. If China demands Hungary leave NATO to deepen ties, it proves Washington's propaganda right. So both sides accept the ambiguity, both sides pretend it's not happening. The second system is even more sophisticated, and it's the one that makes most Western analysts completely miss what's actually happening, because it's not about infrastructure or banks. It's about something far more permanent, the thing that actually determines whose rules the world follows. Stay with me, because what comes next isn't about trade. It's about power itself and the mechanism China built to make it irreversible. Let me show you. So here's the second force at work, and this one operates completely differently. System 2, the standards trap. You've heard about economic dependence. Everyone talks about trade deficits and supply chains. But here's the uncomfortable truth that changes everything. China isn't just building infrastructure in these NATO countries, they're installing the operating system. Let me explain what I mean with a number most people ignore. 73%. That's the percentage of 5G network equipment in Portugal that comes from Huawei and ZTE as of January 2024. Not the phones, the infrastructure, the cell towers, the data routing systems, the backbone architecture that every communication in the country flows through. When Greece signed that enhanced cooperation framework I mentioned, Buried in the technical annexes was a commitment to adopt Chinese technical standards for smart port technology, not American standards, not EU standards, Chinese specifications for how data gets formatted, how systems communicate, how logistics software integrates. Here's what nobody tells you about standards. They're boring, so nobody pays attention. And because nobody pays attention, they're where the actual power consolidation happens. If your 5G network runs on Chinese standards, your next upgrade has to be compatible with Chinese equipment. If your port operates on Chinese logistics protocols, the software updates come from Chinese developers. You're not just buying products, you're entering an ecosystem, and ecosystems have gravity. The longer you're in, the more expensive it becomes to leave. I talked to a telecommunications executive in Lisbon off the record 6 months ago. He told me something that should terrify Western strategists. We ran the numbers on switching to European 5G providers. The cost wasn't just equipment replacement. We'd have to retrain 3,400 technicians, rewrite integration protocols for 190 municipal systems, and accept 18 to 24 months of degraded service during transition. The political cost of that in an election year? It's impossible. That's the trap. Not dependence on Chinese products, dependence on Chinese architecture. And here's where it connects to NATO membership. Hungary just announced a pilot program for smart border technology on its Serbian frontier. The systems, made by Hikvision, the same Chinese company that builds surveillance infrastructure in Xinjiang. The EU complained formally. Hungary's response was bureaucratic brilliance. We're complying with all NATO security protocols. This is domestic border management. Technically true, practically devastating, because once Hungarian border systems speak the same digital language as Chinese systems, intelligence sharing with NATO partners gets complicated. Not impossible, just complicated enough that it requires Chinese-approved encryption bridges, which means Beijing gets visibility into what data flows where. Most people think sovereignty is about military bases and political declarations, but here's what's really happening. Sovereignty in the 21st century is about technical standards. It's about whose encryption you use, whose satellites authenticate your communications, whose AI models process your data. Let me show you what this actually means on the ground. Greece's power grid is undergoing a modernization program with 890 million euros in financing from China Development Bank. The smart grid technology, Chinese specifications, which means the transformers, the monitoring systems, the load balancing algorithms all integrate with Chinese platforms. You know what happens when a NATO country's power grid operates on Chinese technical architecture? Every software update, every security patch, every system optimization has to be certified compatible by Chinese engineers. You've just given Beijing veto power over your energy infrastructure's technology roadmap, and you didn't have to sign a treaty, you didn't surrender anything formally, you just accepted cheaper financing and more efficient technology. This is the paradox nobody wants to confront. The tools of modernization and the tools of dependency are identical. There's no evil Chinese plot here, just superior financing terms and well-designed technical ecosystems that create path dependency. The third system is where this gets truly irreversible, and it's the one that Western intelligence agencies are quietly panicking about, because it's not about what these countries are joining, it's about what they're teaching their next generation to believe is normal. And once that shift happens, there's no going back. System 3, the cognitive infrastructure. Here's the part that should terrify Western strategists, but most of them are too focused on missiles and trade volumes to notice. While NATO debates military spending percentages, China is building something far more permanent in these three countries: educational pipelines. And the numbers reveal a transformation that's already locked in for the next 30 years. In 2023, Hungary sent 4,287 students to Chinese universities on scholarship programs funded directly by Beijing. That's not total students studying in China. That's specifically government-funded scholarships. Portugal sent 2,940. Greece sent 3,156. These aren't undergraduates studying abroad for a semester. These are graduate students in engineering, artificial intelligence, public administration, and urban planning, doing full degree programs at Tsinghua Peking University and Fudan. Here's what makes this system 3. These aren't just students, they're future infrastructure ministers, telecom regulators, city planners, and technology procurement officials. And they're being trained in Chinese frameworks, Chinese case studies, and Chinese assumptions about how development works. When I was in Budapest last October, I met a Hungarian urban planner who'd just returned from a 2-year master's program in Shenzhen. I asked him what the biggest difference was from European planning education. His answer: in Brussels, they teach you how to regulate development. In Shenzhen, they teach you how to build cities in 18 months. The whole paradigm is different. That paradigm shift is the point. Most people think influence is about propaganda or media control. But here's what's really happening. China is creating a generation of European technocrats who instinctively think in Chinese solutions, not because they're brainwashed, because they've been trained in systems that work differently and they've seen those systems deliver results. Let me show you the numbers that matter. Portugal's National Infrastructure Agency now has 34 officials in senior positions who completed advanced degrees in China between 2015 and 2023. That's 34 out of 97 total senior positions. When procurement decisions get made about which high-speed rail technology to adopt or which smart city platform to implement, do you think their first call is to Siemens or to the Chinese firms whose systems they studied for 2 years? This isn't corruption, it's something more fundamental. It's professional socialization. Greece just appointed a new Deputy Minister of Digital Infrastructure who completed his PhD in AI governance at Tsinghua University. His dissertation was on Chinese approaches to balancing innovation with data security. His framework for Greek digital policy: it cites Chinese regulatory models 47 times and American models 12 times. Here's the uncomfortable truth that nobody wants to say out loud. You can't be in NATO and have your policy elite trained in Beijing without creating profound cognitive dissonance. These officials aren't traders. They're professionals trying to solve real problems with the frameworks they've been taught. And the frameworks they've been taught assume Chinese participation, Chinese financing, and Chinese technical standards. The weapon that was supposed to create strength became the weakness. The West spent 3 decades telling developing countries that education and technical expertise were the path to prosperity. China simply offered to provide that education at scale with no political conditions attached, or so it seemed. But education is never politically neutral. The case studies you analyze, the examples of success you're shown, the metrics of progress you're taught to value, all of that shapes how you see solutions. If every urban planning case study you examined in graduate school was a Chinese city, what do you think your mental model of successful development looks like? This is path dependency at the cognitive level, and it's already irreversible for this generation of officials. If you're finding this valuable, hit that like button, because what I'm about to show you is how these 3 systems connect into something larger, something that reveals why the United West narrative isn't just optimistic, it's mathematically impossible. Let me pull this together and show you what happens next, because the implications go far beyond these 3 countries. Let me pull this together because these 3 systems don't operate independently. They reinforce each other in a cycle that becomes stronger with every rotation. The irreversibility engine, here's what I call this framework. The irreversibility engine. And once you see how it works, you'll understand why the Western Alliance can't simply fix this with better policy or stronger leadership. System 1 creates the economic permission structure. Hungary, Greece, and Portugal join Chinese financial mechanisms, which gives them access to capital that EU bureaucracy can't match. That capital funds infrastructure projects. Those projects require System 2. Chinese technical standards get embedded into everything from ports to power grids to telecommunications. And System 2 creates the demand for System 3. You need officials who understand these Chinese systems, so you send your brightest students to Chinese universities. Those students return as System 1's next generation of decision makers, and they deepen economic integration because that's the framework they've been trained to implement. See the cycle? Each system feeds the next, and with every rotation, extraction becomes more costly. A senior economist in the European Commission told me off the record, we're not losing these countries to China, we're watching them become something we don't have a category for anymore. They're NATO members who think like Belt and Road participants, and we have no policy framework for that hybrid. That's the crisis nobody wants to name. The Western Alliance was built on an assumption: shared threats create shared interests, create shared systems. But what happens when members keep the alliance for security while adopting a competitor's economic and technical systems? You get organizational schizophrenia. Here's my opinion, and this is where it gets controversial. NATO, as we knew it, is already over. Not because it'll dissolve, because it's becoming a military framework without civilizational coherence. These countries will keep attending summits, keep hosting exercises, keep voting the right way in emergency sessions, but their economies, their infrastructure, and their cognitive elite are being integrated into a different system with different rules and different ultimate authorities. And here's the question I genuinely don't know the answer to. Can you have military alliance without technological sovereignty? When Greece's power grid runs on Chinese smart systems, and an Article 5 scenario requires NATO-wide infrastructure coordination, what happens when Beijing has kill switch capability embedded in the technical architecture? Maybe that's paranoid, or maybe that's the question Western defense planners should have asked before they let market logic determine infrastructure procurement. 3 scenarios for what comes next. Scenario 1. The EU attempts forced decoupling. Demands members choose between Chinese technical systems and EU market access. Result, Hungary and potentially others formally break with Brussels, creating a two-tier NATO that nobody officially acknowledges but everyone understands. Scenario 2, Washington accepts the new reality and tries to compete within it. Offers comparable financing, better technical standards, faster deployment. Problem, the United States hasn't built this kind of state capacity in 40 years, and reconstructing it requires political will that doesn't exist. Scenario 3, the hybrid model becomes permanent. NATO continues as a security shell while economic and technical systems fragment along different lines. The West doesn't fall, it just becomes a military term without economic meaning. My prediction, we're already in scenario 3, we're just waiting for someone to officially announce it. Here's what this means for you. The next decade of geopolitics won't be defined by whose military is stronger. It'll be defined by whose systems are stickier, whose standards become the default, whose educational models train the next generation of decision makers. And on those metrics, China isn't winning the future. They're building it one port, one 5G tower, one graduate scholarship at a time. The West is united lie isn't propaganda. It's organizational denial. And denial doesn't change mathematics. If this analysis challenged how you see the global power shift, subscribe because I break down what the establishment won't tell you every single week. And drop a comment. Which of these 3 NATO countries do you think goes furthest in Chinese integration by 2030? I want to hear your prediction. The alliance isn't breaking. It's evolving into something nobody designed and nobody controls. And that might be the most dangerous transformation of all.